Welcome to This Explainer. To kick things off today, I actually want you to step away from your desk for just a second. Picture yourself out on the water. You're on a sailboat, the wind is catching, the hull's cutting right through the waves, and you realize you need to make a crucial course adjustment. So you shift the sail. The course changes, and the boat keeps moving forward. But here's the absolutely critical part. What matters in that very moment isn't the decision you just made to move the sail. What matters is exactly what happens next. The wind pushes differently, and the boat responds. The line either holds tight or it doesn't.
And you notice this instantly. You don't read about it in some report a week later, right? You notice it from exactly where you're sitting. You can literally feel it in the tension of the rope in your hands. You can see it in the physical angle of the sail against the sky. You can tell immediately whether your change actually worked. And if it didn't, you adjust again. It's a brilliant, immediate, short loop. Decision, result, adjustment. Nothing is separated here. You and the consequence of your choice are in the exact same space. And that tight loop, that is exactly what keeps the boat aligned and moving efficiently toward its destination.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. Proximity over perfect information. Translating the water to the workplace.
Translating that physical experience on the water to the modern workplace reveals a pretty fascinating dynamic. Because you see, the exact same pattern happens in corporate groups every single day. A decision is made, something changes, work moves forward, a plan is executed, or a new path is taken. But the survival of that project depends entirely on whether the loop stays intact. Which leads us to a really critical question for you to think about. The same thing happens in groups, sure, but do the decision makers actually feel the impact? What matters next in a company is whether the people who made the decision remain close to what happens after the decision is made. Do they see the result? Do they feel the impact on their teams? Do they hear what actually changed on the ground? Keeping this loop intact doesn't require a crystal ball, and it doesn't require perfect information. It just requires proximity.
And this brilliantly illustrates two very different organizational realities. On the short loop side, we have a connected team where a choice leads to a result, the result is immediately visible, and the next choice reflects it. Nothing drifts far from reality because the leaders actually feel the consequences. But look at the delayed loop side. Here, decision makers rely solely on reports. They're separated by layers of management and completely shielded from what happens next. The connection doesn't need to be perfect, but it absolutely must be present. Without it, you shift from a short, immediate loop to a delayed loop, and a very, very dangerous delay takes over.
Which brings us to Section 2, When the Signal Fades, the Silent Killer of Feedback.
Now, we're introducing the concept of distance here, but it's really vital to understand we are not talking about physical distance in space, like, working from different offices or remote work. We're talking about the much more insidious distance in feedback. This distance is the villain of our story today. When leaders don't feel the consequences, the decision still moves forward, but the result, it doesn't come back clearly. Watch how the signal weakens. First, it gets filtered through layers of management, then it gets delayed by reporting cycles, and finally, the bad news gets softened so it doesn't sound quite so harsh to the executives. The signal weakens. The true result of the choice doesn't come back clearly, which means the absolute worst thing happens. The next decision has to be made without fully seeing the reality of the last one.
At first, this is incredibly difficult to notice. The decision still appears to work. Progress continues, and nothing fails immediately. But let's walk through this compounding breakdown. Because correction is no longer continuous, a small gap appears. That small gap turns into a delayed signal. That delayed signal eventually becomes a completely missed signal. And what does a missed signal inevitably lead to? A repeated mistake. The boat is still moving, but it's no longer clear whether it's actually aligned with the destination. A minor drift spirals into a major course deviation entirely because correction just isn't continuous.
Let's move on to Section 3, the weight of decisions, where people decide versus where costs land. We need to shift our focus from the mechanics of feedback to the actual human cost, the risk and the gain that decisions create for people within a group. Because every choice an executive makes carries a weight, and, someone has to carry it. The source material identifies this as the core problem. Where people decide and where costs land can separate. Think about it. When you make a decision at the top of a hierarchy, the friction, the extra hours, and the operational pain, they often land entirely on the people at the bottom. It is absolutely critical for the health of an organization that those who decide stay deeply tied to what their choices actually do to others.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is exactly why leaders drift away from the fallout of their choices. What are those corporate forces? Well, first, incentives usually favor visible wins over visible costs. You get a massive bonus for launching the shiny new software, right? Not for the weekends the IT department lost trying to keep it from crashing. Second, In large settings, effects just land unevenly. Third, distance makes harm so much easier to miss. And finally, the most human force of all, pushing pain downhill is just simply easier than carrying it yourself.
But the best groups fight these forces. They operate under a completely different standard. Look at this incredibly powerful quote from the sources. If we called it, we sit with the fallout. Leaders feel the consequences on this. We're not sliding the pain down a layer. I mean, wow. That is the ultimate standard for executive accountability. It's a line drawn in the sand. It means owning the decision all the way through to its completion, even if, and especially if, it creates friction.
The effect of taking this stance is profound. Accountability stays firmly in view. Harm becomes much harder to shrug off, and it is exponentially harder to repeat harm without actually owning it. When leaders take this stance, costs do not quietly slide onto someone else's desk. And because of that, the team's trust that correction will actually work holds firm. They know leadership is right there in the boat with them, feeling the exact same tension on the ropes.
Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 4. Closing the feedback loop. Completing the cycle. Let's look at the pillars of a vibrant, responsive group where that dangerous drift simply cannot hide. A completed loop requires 3 distinct elements holding strong. First, dissent is welcomed. People absolutely must be able to say, "Hey, the wind changed," without fear. Second, feedback drives change. Hearing the dissent isn't enough. The sail actually has to be adjusted based on what's heard. And third, leaders feel the consequences. They stay tied to what is real, to the correction, and to answering for the outcomes. These 3 elements are exactly what keep the boat aligned.
So, the crucial point is this ultimate triad: signal, adjustment, result. When all 3 of these hold, the group remains highly responsive. But when even one piece weakens, something insidious begins to happen. The signal fades, the gap grows. And here's the truly fascinating part. The first thing you notice when the loop breaks is not immediate failure. The boat doesn't instantly capsize. No, the first thing you notice is quiet. Nothing is said.
Because that quiet is often exactly where suppressed disagreement begins. Which leaves us with this final, vital question to reflect on today. Look at your own workplace. Think about your own team. When the signal begins to fade, is dissent welcomed? Or is the disagreement quietly suppressed while the pain is pushed downhill? Understanding how your team answers that question is the very first step to getting your boat back on course. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you some powerful tools to think about your own feedback loops.